Some hearts are broken in public, though no one dares to whisper why. The storm had not yet begun, though the night air pressed heavy against the tall windows of the Count's chamber, carrying with it the faint scent of wet stone and autumn leaves. Moonlight, wan and silver, fell across the polished floorboards, glinting off the brass fittings of the bed where he had lain restless hours before, betrayed by dreams that promised comfort but delivered only emptiness. The princess had gone. There was no fanfare, no soft farewell whispered between silks and shadows, only a folded note, its edges precise as her indifference, left atop the silken coverlet like a cruel punctuation mark to the intimacy they had once shared. The Count stirred, eyelids heavy and bloodshot, hair disheveled, the faintest stubble darkening his jaw. He did not rise immediately, for pride, though tattered, clung stubbornly to him. Pride, which had once commanded salons and whispered admiration through gilded corridors, now mocked him from the mirror across the room, reflecting a man abandoned in both body and reputation. His fingers brushed the note absently, scanning the inked lines as if hoping that another glance might summon the warmth she had taken with her. "Forgive me, but I cannot remain where you are not my equal," it read. Her handwriting, precise and cold, held no trace of affection, no hesitation, no flicker of remorse. She had left him not for another, not for scandal, but for disdain, the most piercing kind, reserved for those who dared to love without permission. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows lengthening with accusation. Each piece of furniture, the ornate bureau, the carved headboard, the gilded frames of forgotten ancestors, seemed to watch him in quiet judgment, complicit in the humiliation inflicted. A timid knock echoed against the chamber door, delicate yet insistent, and he barely acknowledged it. The maid entered then, a soft presence in the dim light, her skirts whispering across the polished floor. She carried no airs, no noble entitlement, only the quiet dignity of one accustomed to seeing the world in layers unseen by those who strode through it with title and fortune. Her eyes, a muted brown, held a cautious curiosity that did not betray fear, yet hinted at recognition of the Count not as a master to be served, but as a man betrayed. "Sir," she said, voice low, measured. She paused, for what could one say in the presence of such evident despair? "I shall not abandon you," she finally murmured, a boldness in her simplicity that made him glance up sharply. It was an offer that carried weight far heavier than gold or title. The maid knelt briefly to arrange the covers at the foot of the bed, her fingers deft yet hesitant, a gesture that spoke of courage, humility, and something akin to hope. For a moment, the Count allowed himself the shocking relief of being seen, not as a count, not as a man who must mask every emotion, but as someone stripped bare by absence and by the cruelty of prideful love. The household, of course, did not yet know. Whispers in hallways, soft gasps behind lace curtains, the quiet ripples of scandal among servants, all waited like predators to pounce upon the vulnerable. Yet in this small, private corner of the grand mansion, the world's judgment felt distant, almost irrelevant. The maid moved as if understanding that, despite the gilded cages of society and etiquette, some truths could be held only in shared silence. The Count's eyes, dark and haunted, met hers. For the first time that night, a faint flicker of something long suppressed, a spark that had been buried beneath layers of decorum and disappointment, stirred in his chest. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that connection, in its truest form, could survive even the abandonment of those meant to shield us from the world's cruelty. Outside, the wind began to rise, whispering against the mansion walls, stirring the candles that lined the corridors. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, its toll resonant with judgment, with time marching forward regardless of human frailty. The Count's fingers lingered over the note once more, hesitant, before letting it fall to the floor. He did not yet speak, for words would demand courage he was only beginning to muster. The maid, patient and steady, did not urge him, nor did she retreat. She simply remained, a quiet anchor in a room adrift with loss and humiliation. And then, almost imperceptibly, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips, a smile not of amusement but of cautious acknowledgment. Perhaps the night had not promised comfort, yet it had offered something rarer, a witness to his pain who might, if courage permitted, become the very reason to endure it. A distant murmur of laughter, carried on the night air from the servants' quarters, seemed suddenly intrusive, a reminder that the world beyond the chamber would not pause. Yet in that private, dimly lit room, the Count allowed himself the fleeting luxury of vulnerability, of being witnessed, of being human. And in that allowance, a quiet, defiant hope began to stir, fragile as the candlelight but relentless as the tide. "I shall not abandon you, sir," she whispered once more, and this time the Count, chest tight and heart alight, simply nodded, the weight of his humiliation softened, if only slightly, by the steadfastness of another. Outside, the storm had begun at last, wind and rain thrumming against stone and glass, echoing the tumult within. Inside, a different storm had begun as well, the storm of human connection, fragile yet undeniable, and the slow, perilous ascent from shame toward something that might, against all odds, become love. It was only the beginning. A gift may speak what words dare not. Dawn broke with a muted gray hush, sunlight struggling through the mist that clung stubbornly to the Count's gardens. The dewdrops shimmered on the lawns like scattered diamonds, yet the beauty of the morning did little to soften the tension that hung in the mansion's corridors. Word of the princess's abandonment had not yet fully circulated among the elite, but within the walls of his home, the Count's vulnerability had begun to stir whispers, a delicate, poisonous ripple of speculation. Servants glanced surreptitiously, their eyes wide with curiosity and mild disapproval. Even the gardener, stooped and weathered, cast furtive looks toward the chambers where his master now lingered, haunted yet dignified. It was in this quiet tension that the maid moved with deliberate purpose, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the overgrown hedgerows along the estate's northern edge. Bluebells, pale as the sky before storm, intertwined with delicate sprigs of lavender and the faintest nodding of daisies, their scent sharp and subtly sweet. She held them as if they were not mere blooms, but messengers of courage, defiance, and devotion. The act was perilous. What would it mean to offer flowers to a man of rank when society's rules had decreed silence and propriety? Yet she moved with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that some gestures transcend protocol. The Count, pacing in the study that smelled faintly of candle smoke and old parchment, glanced up at her entrance. His coat, loosened and rumpled from a restless night, did little to obscure the tension in his shoulders. He expected caution, perhaps a lowering of eyes and whispered apologies, but what he found instead was audacity cloaked in humility. "Sir," she said softly, presenting the bouquet, "I found these for you. Perhaps they may brighten the hours when all else seems unkind." Her voice carried no tremor of fear, yet beneath its calm surface lay the weight of risk, an unspoken acknowledgment that society would see her action as audacious, even improper. He accepted the flowers with a glance that lingered longer than decorum would permit. The scent was faint but restorative, carrying the earthiness of hedgerows and the delicate insistence of life that refuses to be crushed, even under the weight of scandal. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "A gift, you say? How rare in a world so often cruel." There was a flicker of something unguarded in his tone, a vulnerability that had begun to emerge in the quiet hours of his isolation. Their shared glance was interrupted by the faint echo of footsteps along the corridor. A noble visitor, one of the princess's acquaintances, had arrived unexpectedly. Rumors had already begun to swell. The Count, abandoned, rumored to be despairing, now receiving small attentions from a mere maid. The juxtaposition was irresistible to a society that thrived on scandal. The visitor's eyes, sharp and calculating, caught the delicate handling of the flowers, and the faint blush on the Count's cheek. Whispers followed like shadows. "What is this, a gift from a servant? And surely such familiarity is dangerous for one of his station." The maid, unfazed, straightened her posture, letting her gaze meet his only briefly before returning it to the bouquet as if to say, wordlessly, that loyalty and courage required no social rank. The Count, though aware of the eyes upon him, allowed a quiet defiance to bloom within. He felt the subtle thrill of agency in a world that had sought to diminish him with a note of disdain and the absence of a promised partner. In accepting the flowers, he was not merely receiving their beauty. He was signaling, however gently, that he would not be entirely dictated by expectation or by the cruel choreography of high society. Later, in the twilight that gathered like smoke over the estate, the Count and the maid walked briefly along the rose-bordered paths, the wet earth leaving faint prints beneath their shoes. They spoke little, for words were insufficient, and the silence between them carried a weight far heavier than conversation. Each glance, each careful inclination of the head, conveyed devotion, curiosity, and the faintest stirrings of trust. The scandal, however, was inevitable. One of the household staff, an older chambermaid with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue, witnessed their exchange and whispered into eager ears the tale of intimacy. The Count accepting flowers, the maid's gaze lingering, the way he had smiled softly at her words. Soon, the rumor would spread, a gentle, insidious wind through the corridors of power and propriety. Yet in that moment, the Count allowed himself a private victory. The bouquet, humble though it was, had become a token of connection, a symbol that even in abandonment he might find companionship, courage, and, dare he think it, love. The maid, seeing the faint shift in his expression, understood her own growing boldness was mirrored in him. He was learning as she had, that affection could exist quietly, safely in small gestures, before it demanded recognition from the cruel gaze of the world. As they parted for the evening, the Count's gaze lingered on her retreating figure, the weight of expectation and scandal pressing upon him from all sides. Yet there was promise in that look, unspoken and radiant, that despite whispers, despite judgment, despite the ever-watchful eyes of society, some connections could not be diminished. The visitors returned to the drawing-room that night carried with it subtle tremors of curiosity and speculation, and the mansion's halls buzzed quietly with expectation. And in the quiet of the Count's chamber, the maid arranged the bouquet in a modest vase, her hand steady, her heart quickened by the knowledge that she had, in a small way, begun to rewrite the rules of propriety. For a society so enamored of scandal, the most daring act of all was to care, quietly and bravely, for another, regardless of the consequences. The storm of whispers and judgment loomed, but beneath it, the first embers of trust and desire had been lit, fragile and trembling, yet impossibly persistent. To confess in silence is sometimes braver than to speak aloud. The night had fallen with a weighty stillness, broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the tall, mullioned windows of the Count's library. Firelight danced across the spines of ancient tomes, flickering over carved oak shelves and glinting in the brass fittings of the fireplace, casting long shadows that swayed like ghosts of past confidences. The scent of damp earth from the garden mingled with the lingering aroma of parchment and candle wax, creating a sanctuary apart from the judgmental world beyond the estate walls. The Count sat in a high-backed chair, shoulders tense, fingers laced over a folded handkerchief, his gaze fixed on the flames as though willing them to illuminate a path through his turmoil. The events of the past days weighed upon him like an iron cloak, the princess's abandonment, the silent scorn of society, the faint, creeping fear that he might never reclaim his dignity. Yet within that darkness, a fragile light persisted. The presence of the maid, whose loyalty and subtle courage had begun to unsettle the rigid walls he had built around his heart. She approached quietly, holding no torch of ceremony, no deference beyond the polite bow of a servant, yet in her eyes lay something far bolder than obedience. Something akin to understanding. She set a small tray upon the table, a modest cup of tea and a plate of biscuits, the steam curling upward in delicate spirals, as if to remind him that warmth could exist even in the coldest of nights. "Sir," she said softly, "you need not bear this alone." The words were simple, yet charged with unspoken meaning. They did not merely offer comfort. They dared to acknowledge the depth of his pain, the enormity of the shame he felt at being abandoned by one who was meant to cherish him. He exhaled slowly, the first breath of confession escaping like a dam yielding to pressure. "It is not merely abandonment I endure," he murmured, voice roughened by sleepless hours. "It is the humiliation of expectation betrayed, the silent judgment of those who claim to uphold propriety, and the insidious whisper that I am somehow diminished for loving too freely." His eyes, dark and haunted, lifted to meet hers, searching not for pity, but for recognition of shared humanity. The maid knelt beside him, careful not to impose, careful to bridge the chasm between their stations with the quiet bravery of one who understands that loyalty is a form of rebellion. "I see it, sir," she said, her voice steady, yet quivering with the weight of honesty. "I see the despair, and the courage it has taken merely to rise each morning in a world that delights in the misfortunes of those it deems beneath its notice. And I choose to stand with you despite the world, despite scandal." The Count's hand trembled as it hovered over the cup, the heat of the tea grounding him as much as it reminded him of her presence. In that moment he realized that the maid had offered more than kindness. She had offered acknowledgement, a mirror to his vulnerability without judgment, and in doing so had given him a choice that society would never permit. "Your courage is extraordinary," he confessed, voice barely more than a whisper. "It is one thing to endure indignity alone, it is quite another to witness it with steadfast grace." A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips, fragile as porcelain, yet carrying the tremor of hope. And yet, even this solace is tempered by the thought that he glanced briefly toward the shadowed corner of the room where her modest gown swayed, might be punished for her devotion or worse, misjudged for daring to offer companionship to one of my station. She inclined her head, accepting the acknowledgement without hesitation, as though daring the very walls of the mansion to contain her resolve. "Sir, some judgments are worth defying. Some gestures are worth the risk. You have been abandoned by one who held the title of affection, Yet I offer you what she could not: presence, loyalty, and the courage to face the world as it is together." A silence fell between them, heavy and reverent, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of rain. Within that quiet, the Count's heart, wounded, wary, and long accustomed to concealment, began to unfurl. Words of affection were not yet spoken, yet the gravity of connection passed between them like an uncharted current, electric and undeniable. Then, the delicate chime of the chamber door interrupted the intimacy, heralding the arrival of a missive from the princess herself. He unfolded the note with a mixture of dread and inevitability, and the words, though carefully chosen, carried the unmistakable weight of regret and threat. She would return, she hinted, though with veiled contempt and the expectation of reclamation. The maid, observing his reaction, did not flinch. She understood that the note could provoke fear, anger, or indecision, yet she did not waver. Her hand, resting lightly on the back of his chair, conveyed what her voice dared not: that he need not face this intrusion alone, and that together, they might withstand whatever tempest was sent. The Count's gaze lingered on hers, and for the first time since the princess's abandonment, he felt the stirrings of resolve, not the brittle, performative courage demanded by society, but the quiet, inner fortitude born of recognition, trust, and the tentative beginnings of love. In that shared glance, the past humiliation was acknowledged but no longer sovereign. He could choose another path, guided not by duty or fear, but by connection and courage. The firelight flickered, and for a brief, perfect moment, the library became a world apart, a sanctuary where titles were irrelevant, where whispers of scandal held no sway, and where the fragile, daring truth of two hearts daring to see each other could breathe freely. And in that fragile, sacred space, the Count whispered almost to himself, "Perhaps, this is what I have sought all along, not solace from the world, but the courage to endure it with someone steadfast at my side." The maid's hand lingered a heartbeat longer before retreating, and though no words passed, the unspoken promise between them was unmistakable: that together they would face the coming storm, and that the first steps toward a love that defied judgment, expectation, and fear had been taken. The night deepened, rain thrumming insistently against the glass, and in its steady rhythm the Count felt, for the first time, that the pulse of hope might just surpass the ache of betrayal. The heart chooses where it will reside, and no title can command it otherwise. The ballroom glittered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into rainbows across the polished parquet floor. Music swelled in lilting crescendos, the orchestra's strings weaving through the murmurs of well-dressed nobility, whose jeweled eyes gleamed with curiosity and expectation. Masks adorned many faces, yet beneath the silk and feathers, gossip rippled like an undercurrent, tales of the Count's abandonment, whispers of his fragile dignity, and the audacious presence of a maid whose loyalty had become legend in hushed corridors. The Count stood near the fireplace, coat perfectly adjusted, posture rigid, yet tension coiled in his shoulders. Each note of the orchestra struck against the residue of shame he had carried for days, a reminder of the society that demanded decorum even in the midst of betrayal. And yet, tonight, there was a tremor of defiance in his stance. The maid approached, her presence understated yet impossible to ignore. The soft rustle of her gown drew his attention, and in that movement, the unspoken vow between them thrummed with audacity. "Sir," she murmured, barely audible over the swell of violins, "the world will watch, but I will not falter." He turned fully toward her, eyes dark and intense, and for a heartbeat, the ballroom, the orchestra, the assembly of nobles, all vanished. He spoke, voice carrying across the flickering firelight and the rustle of silk, steady and magnetic. "No crown, no title, not even betrayal can undo what my heart has found." His words, deliberate and daring, pierced the air with the weight of defiance and sincerity. Gasps rose quietly among the masked guests, some of recognition, some of scandal. A few eyes widened, others narrowed with judgment. Yet the Count did not falter. He stepped forward, closing the space between them with deliberate grace. Each movement was measured, revealing neither doubt nor hesitation, only the certainty of a man reclaiming both dignity and desire. The maid met him halfway, her cheeks tinged with color yet her gaze unwavering. "Sir," she began, then paused, the weight of propriety and potential censure pressing against the boldness of her devotion. She let her hand brush his, a contact as fleeting as it was incendiary, and in that touch, the tension that had held them in delicate balance for days ignited into something unmistakable: connection, recognition, and mutual resolve. The princess's specter, ever present in whispers and speculation, threatened to intrude upon this fragile equilibrium. Yet when the Count's gaze swept the room, He met every stare with calm, subtle defiance. He did not falter at the judgment of peers or the imagined wrath of a spurned noblewoman. His heart, finally aligned with its desire, demanded transparency, and his voice rang clear, "Let all who would question, question. I answer to no expectation save the fidelity of my own heart." A ripple of shock passed through the assembly. Some of the nobles murmured, scandalized, yet the Count's poise was unbroken. The maid's composure mirrored his resolve, her posture proud despite the invisible chains of class and protocol. Together they embodied a quiet rebellion, a challenge to the rigid choreography of society and the cruel weight of abandonment. He offered his arm to her, a gesture at once protective and declarative, and she accepted, not as a subordinate, but as a partner whose loyalty had been earned in the crucible of shared suffering. Their movement toward the center of the ballroom became a statement, each step a repudiation of shame and an embrace of courage. One by one the murmurs shifted. Shock softened into admiration, and curiosity into reluctant acknowledgement. The world, for all its intricate rules and endless scrutiny, could not erase the authenticity of their connection. Even in the face of potential scandal, the Count and the maid revealed a truth more powerful than rumor. Love, once recognized, demands acknowledgement regardless of station or expectation. He lowered his mask, the motion deliberate, and for the first time that evening, his expression was unguarded. Eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, and he whispered, audible only to her, "I would rather endure every rumor, every gaze of disapproval, than live without the knowledge that you stand beside me." She inclined her head, faint tears shimmering at the edges of her lashes, yet her smile was resolute. "And I, sir, would rather face the world at your side than hide in comfort without truth." A silence fell over the ballroom, more powerful than any applause as the orchestra's melody lingered in the air. The world outside could continue its judgment, could continue to assign value to rank and title, but within that space the Count and the maid had reclaimed their agency. Their eyes spoke a language older than words, older than scandal, fidelity of heart, courage in love, and the quiet defiance of two souls who had endured humiliation and emerged unbroken. The music swelled, and they moved together across the polished floor, each step measured, elegant, yet infused with the fire of victory. In that movement, the story of abandonment was transformed into a story of reclamation, of a love forged in vulnerability and tempered by risk. And as the chandeliers cast their final brilliance over the ballroom, the Count whispered once more, firm and unshakable, "No expectation, no betrayal, no title, can ever command where my heart shall reside." The maid's hand found his, and together, they stood amidst the gleaming marble and flickering candlelight, unbowed by society, unbroken by shame, and infinitely alive in the quiet, triumphant certainty of mutual devotion. The whispers of scandal would not cease, but in the glow of defiance and the warmth of hard-won trust, neither cared. Tonight, the Count and the maid had claimed what truly mattered, each other. Some love is forged not in comfort, but in the courage to remain. Dawn crept slowly over the Count's estate, brushing the gardens with a fragile light that turned each dew-laden petal into a jewel, each twisted branch into a silhouette of quiet grace. The storm of the previous nights had passed, leaving the air crisp, scented with wet earth and the faint tang of roses pressed by rain. The mansion, still shadowed and imposing, seemed almost reverent in this early hour, as if it too had witnessed the quiet battles of pride, shame, and the first sparks of daring love. The Count stood on the terrace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the mist curling above the distant hedgerows. He had walked the corridors of judgment, the salons of scandal, and the whispers of betrayal, yet each step had only clarified what he now understood with unflinching clarity. No title, no expectation, no past humiliation could dictate the allegiance of his heart. Behind him, soft as a shadow, the maid approached, her skirts whispering against the stone floor. She did not startle him. He had come to expect her presence as an anchor in the turbulence of his life, a quiet force that defied the rigid structures of propriety. She stopped a respectful pace behind him, letting him gather the courage to speak first, knowing that his words, when they came, would carry the full weight of vulnerability and authority combined. "You have endured much, sir," she said at last, her voice a delicate murmur that blended with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a morning bird. "And yet here you stand, unshaken in spirit, even when all else sought to unmake you." He turned, the first blush of sunlight catching the sharp planes of his face, and for a moment, the storm of nights past seemed to condense into the gravity of a single gaze. "It is not endurance alone that has brought me here," he admitted, voice low, carrying both confession and command. "It is the courage to see another, truly see them, and to allow oneself to be seen in return. You have given me that courage, and it is a debt that no wealth or rank could ever repay. She stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her, yet her posture radiated an unwavering bravery. Then take nothing from me, sir, but what you would have of your own choosing. I am neither jewel nor prize. I'm only steadfast. He moved, deliberate and unhurried, until the distance between them vanished, the morning light catching their shared shadow and intertwining it with the marble and ivy. His hand lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and in that touch there was neither command nor hesitation, only the acknowledgement of a bond forged through adversity and trial. Steadfast, he repeated softly, the word tasting of reverence and promise. Yes, steadfast. It is all I have ever desired, though I did not know it until now. Let the world whisper, let scandal linger. What I seek is neither gold nor comfort, but you. Only you. Her lips curved, subtle but radiant, and she allowed her fingers to rest lightly on his hand, a fragile bridge between station and heart. Then it is given freely, sir, she whispered. Not from fear, not from expectation, but from choice. From truth. They stood, the wind from the gardens stirring the edges of their garments, as though the estate itself approved of this unorthodox union. Each heartbeat between them was a testament to battles survived, the humiliation of abandonment, the suffocating constraints of society, the seductive whispers of propriety that demanded silence. Yet here they were, unbowed, unbroken, and infinitely alive in the intimacy of their mutual recognition. From the terrace below, the staff emerged quietly, drawn by the subtle aura of resolution, yet careful to respect the private triumph unfolding above. Even the house itself seemed to breathe easier, as if the mansion's walls, steeped in centuries of rigid decorum, had been touched by the audacity of authentic devotion. The princess's looming shadow, a specter that had haunted the count's thoughts for days, had vanished from his mind entirely. Her potential return, her past betrayals, her cold expectations, all dissolved in the undeniable presence of this steadfast, courageous woman. The past had not been erased, but it had been rendered powerless, diminished by the strength of two hearts choosing each other in defiance of convention and fear. He lowered his gaze, resting it on her hands, now intertwined with his, and spoke with the quiet finality of a man who had reclaimed his own destiny. It is not the world's approval I sought, but yours, and yours alone. With you I am whole. Without you I am nothing. A tear glimmered in her eye, but she did not flinch. Instead, she met him fully, the weight of her own courage matching his, their shared heartbeat echoing louder than the murmurs of any scandal that might follow. And I, sir, have found in you the strength to endure, the trust to love, and the freedom to be myself. In this we are equals. For a moment time itself seemed to pause. The morning mist hung suspended above the gardens, the roses bowed beneath the weight of rain yet lifted in subtle triumph, and the count and the maid existed in a space where fear and expectation could not reach them. Then, as the first true light of day fell across their joined hands, the count drew her close, not in the possessive gestures of society, but in the quiet intimacy of shared victory. They stood together, anchored by courage, defined by choice, and illuminated by a love that had emerged not from ease, but from trial and steadfast devotion. In that fleeting, eternal moment, the mansion, the gardens, the whispered judgments of the world, all became background to the undeniable truth. Two souls had claimed each other in defiance of shame, expectation, and fear, and in doing so, had discovered the rarest treasure of all, the unwavering certainty of love chosen freely and courageously against all odds. And as the wind lifted, scattering petals across the terrace, the count and the maid shared their first true smile, not of relief, not of fleeting joy, but of unshakable knowledge that their hearts had found their rightful home. The storm had passed. The whispers would continue. But within the walls of that estate, in the fragile, luminous dawn, two hearts remained unbroken, steadfast, and irrevocably entwined.